In this introductory Photoshop demonstration, we're going to go over the three color models that we'll be using primarily: RGB, CMYK, HSB, how to utilize the color sliders, and we'll use a selection tool in the paint bucket to fill a shape and mix colors. We'll also create a shape using the shape tool and learn how to adjust the fill color of that shape on the stage. So let's get started. The three primary color models in Photoshop that we're going to talk about at this point are located here in the color floating panel. Under Window, be sure that your color panel is selected and showing. With the color panel selected, you can use the little drop-down menu at right, and you can see we have the RGB, HSB, and CMYK sliders that we're going to talk about in this demonstration. The RGB color slider is sometimes called the Roy G. Biv color model. It's based on what would happen if you shine a light on certain amounts of red, green, and blue. What would that perceptual hue, what would that visual color look like? And RGB color model is known as an additive color model because notice how as I pull the slider across, I am adding the amount of red and I'm adding the amount of green to this color, and I can add the amount of blue to make it a little bit more aquamarine. So that is why RGB color model is known as an additive color model. The more color you add, the more vibrant that hue appears. This is in contrast to the CMYK color model. CMYK is primarily used for printing processes. It is most closely related to the inks that printers use, and it's a percentage of these translucent inks, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, that are combined when paper, a white paper, is run through a printing press. It is the percentage of these colors that are subtracted from 100%, so 75% of cyan, maybe 45% magenta. If we add a little more yellow, we're making kind of this forest green color by adding a little more black. Watch what happens when we move the sliders to 100%. That means all of the translucent inks are combined on the paper as they're run through the press, and it just makes this flat kind of black color. It is known as a subtractive method because as we subtract color, or we subtract ink on the printing press, or the percentage of ink that is added, then we begin to see the colors, or the perceptual colors, that we're trying to create. So I want you to try pulling the color sliders around and noticing how the subtractive CMYK model contrasts to the additive RGB model. And just when you thought things weren't all that complicated, you can add one additional slider to the mix, and that is known as the hue, saturation, and brightness slider. Hue refers to the perceptual color. What we see on screen is similar to what will print, or it attempts to be. It's not always 100%. There is a science behind it. You can calibrate your monitor to more closely match what your printer has. You can work with your printer to get a real close match, but please note that what you see on screen isn't always what will be the printed result. Notice how I use the hue slider to actually change the perceptual hue, or the color that we see. So I'm in the blues area, I'm in the reds area here. If I stay in the green mode, I can saturate or desaturate the color. Saturation refers to the percentage of gray that is added to a color to make it less saturated as you add more gray, or more saturated, very bright and vibrant, as you reduce the amount of gray that is added to the color. And then brightness refers to the amount of white or black that is added to the color. So I encourage you to press pause at this time and just move about in the color sliders and kind of see the different changes that occur and mix some different colors. Also, I want you to notice that the foreground and background color here in your color mixer are also represented in your tools panel as foreground and background color. I can toggle the foreground and background color or switch the two by simply clicking this double-sided curved arrow. So press pause and make some changes in the color using the various sliders that we just talked about, noting the difference between the additive color model of RGB and the subtractive color model of CMYK. After you have played around with the color sliders a little bit, you're probably eager to actually create and make some colors on your own. To do that, let's start with a blank slate. Under File, New, let's open a new page. We don't need to name it for now. Let's start at 800 by 600 with a 72 DPI resolution, which is the typical resolution for web delivery. And let's start with the color mode of RGB. If we're starting in the color mode of RGB, let's look at our RGB sliders and let's build, using our selection tool, let's build an ellipse. The elliptical marquee tool might be hidden under your rectangular marquee tool. So click and hold until you can select your elliptical marquee tool and click and drag on the stage. Notice how I've made an ellipse and it's signified by these little marching ants. Also notice that our background by default is a white background and it is locked. We can unlock that background and make changes to it by clicking, double-clicking on the lock and changing that background to a layer. Well, we'll just call it white. We can add a new layer if we wanted to. We could call this one by double-clicking on the layer name Ellipse. And I want to fill this ellipse with color. It will fill with my foreground color. The paint bucket tool is used to fill the selection. The paint bucket tool may be hidden under your gradient tool. So just click and hold until you can find your paint bucket tool. Using the paint bucket tool, click in the middle of our ellipse selection and we filled it with green. Watch what happens when I toggle between foreground and background, and of course your colors are going to be different than mine. I, in this case, have now selected the magenta color and I've moved that to foreground color. And if I click in the ellipse, it is now filled with that magenta color. So I'd like for you to now try creating a selection on the stage and filling it using the paint bucket tool with one of the colors that you mixed. Now what I'd like you to try is deselecting this ellipse. I do this by using my Command D on the Macintosh. It would be Control plus D on the PC. That deselects the ellipse tool. I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to create a shape. In this case, I'm going to create a square or a rectangle using my rectangle tool. I'm going to click on the rectangle tool. I'm going to click and pull the rectangle across the stage. Notice how by default it pulls the foreground color. if I want to change that color, I have to actually click on the layer thumbnail and choose a different color. That's how I can create a shape, and it's a vector shape, a vector-based shape that is scalable, which is different from the ellipse that we made using the selection tool. We'll get into the intricacies of vector shapes versus bitmap or rendered shapes on the stage at a later module. But for now, try creating different shapes on the stage. You can create different layers, make new layers, create new shapes, mix colors, change the colors by double-clicking on the left side of your shape layer. And you can utilize the various color sliders that we've discussed. We can change the brightness. We could change to a different hue. So notice the relationship between the color sliders in this panel, which is known as your color picker panel, as opposed to using the color sliders that you've already experimented with. Again, for you to review and bring up the color picker panel, you just simply click in the foreground color and it brings up the color picker. And you have the ability to work with those 3 sliders that we've just introduced so far. Feel free to experiment creating new layers and shapes and mixing colors on the stage. Please let me know if you have any questions, and have fun.